Good evening, everyone. We're back. It's been almost a month we've been without a live show that wasn't part of the Festival of Economics. So hello to you all. Thanks so much for joining us tonight on Facebook, Twitter, and also on YouTube. Kieran, how are you doing? What have you been up to so far this week?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm just back to full-time politics because we've been on recess. So a lot of catching up during that time as well.
But nothing's been happening when you've been off, Kieran. Nothing's been happening when you've been.
There's been lots of things happening, but of course, I just want to highlight a book I'm listening to just now by Ian Dunt called How Westminster Works. This is granular in the detail of his dysfunction. So for people who are interested in that, I'd really recommend that. And I was just going to bring up that there's a potential for extra taxation on second homes being proposed today as well, which is quite interesting too.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I think, you and I are both very keen to see a new progressive approach for the new SNP administration, and this looks like it's the start of that. So fantastic. There's also a really good report that was out today by Reform Scotland about the new or potential devolved powers on VAT. So I'm going to look at that little bit of report, have a chat with the author, and we might have that as a patron only exclusive episode, or we might release it on here. So we'll decide on that. So plenty going on. You mentioned books. Well, tonight we're going to talk with the author of this Crack-Up Capitalism. Karen and I interviewed him last week. Fascinating guy. A lot of really good stories. A lot of stuff that's really pertinent to the UK and to Scotland. So that we've got that episode coming up. So stick with us for that. I also want to mention it's like the book review club tonight, Karen. I also wanted to mention this book, The Economics of Belonging by Martin Sandbu. Really good. A lot of interesting policy suggestions in here. And this is also the first Scotonomics book in our economic book club, which is in June. So anyone who wants to join our online discussion, all you need to do is borrow or buy this book, read it, and then you can join our discussion. So again, it's the Economics of Belonging, and that should be a fascinating conversation because it's a really, really interesting book. Well, before we get started on the episode, a little surprise for you, Karen, but I wanted to show you some clips from the Festival of Economics. We're almost edited and cleaned up. Nearly 30 sessions, which has taken us a while to do. We've only got about 4 or 5 that we need to upload. They're all available to our patrons on our patron site and our attendees of the event. But we've got this little, I suppose, just a series of highlights from the event. So I want to show you this before we dive into the episode tonight.
You know what? I think that there's empire hangover everywhere, and
I'm looking forward to a really frank and honest and open discussion.
Where is the market right now? What should the economy be focusing on?
Great to be, almost in Dundee. So I'm sitting in Barry in South Wales, which is probably most famous at the moment for Gavin and Stacey.
If we would have had a similar conversation 10 years ago, it would have been, we can't have a central bank, or we can. But now we've got two people arguing on what type of central bank or reserve bank we have. So I think we've made considerable progress
in Scotland, which is a very fuel energy rich country, how little control we have over it. And I think that those conversations did come up in the 2014 to 2016 period. I think, though, we have to look at what went wrong subsequently.
Fiscal restraint, fiscal responsibility is really, really pernicious, and it affects the very nature of how we can create political change, I think.
Do you think that Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss understood MMT?
God knows what they thought they were doing.
I don't think the UK government's like a household though. I think the household analogy people like, because a household has a budget, you spend your budget, if you don't, you borrow the budget, but it's not like a
So space, AI, health tech, big surge as well in agri-tech. Scotland's just a very, very exciting place to be at the minute if you're...
So the economy is driving the climate crisis in the fundamental sense that the source of all our wealth is what we find for free in nature.
Empire, by its very nature, regardless of how the British tried to spin it with civilising ideologies, and Scots too for that matter, it was fundamentally an economic project.
There's no question that land is going out of food production and into carbon capture at the moment.
Politics, what's the two saddest words in English language? If only, and I would have taken a different decision, right, fine. I'm telling you, overwhelmingly, the economics and politics of 2012 said that was the right policy.
Actually did was, I got ChatGPT to develop a suite of models, which actually Dirk is one of the world experts in, which is called stock flow consistent models.
I would probably say stability and an inflation target does make sense.
It's very, very instructive that countries like Jamaica, who did have tighter regulations on their banks and tighter regulations on their housing sector, did not fall over nearly as badly as countries like Britain did in 2007.
And I think that speaks to sort of this divorce of economy and biophysical reality and a lack of awareness of the different challenges that we are up against.
Scottish Government's taken on all of the responsibility of a just transition, doesn't have any of the authority for this. And politically, that looks incredibly naive.
We understand that when an economy grows, it does not mean that everyone's income is rising. We know, that trickle-down economics is a completely flawed theory.
We will need to spend carbon to make changes, and unfortunately, in the medium long run, this is where we'll see the carbon offsets taking place.
I think communities actually are getting up and doing it for themselves now. So I think there's a widespread across the whole of Scotland when you're seeing really innovative things of house building, and the energy schemes, the hydro schemes that they're running themselves.
View on the publication that we all know and love, which is GERS. So let me say a little bit about GERS.
Making things happen again though, isn't it? Rather than just being a talking shop.
Sounds like a better system already. Let's finish now. Thank you very much.
Wow.
Okay, does that bring back some memories?
You did a really good job on that. I think that brought up a lot of really good memories. And oh, thanks, Charles. We enjoy. At least I enjoyed it. I think William had a lot more responsibility than me, so it was harder for him. But I had a great time, and we met some really interesting people. Had some really interesting discussions. And William, I think we're going to do another one, aren't we?
Yes, we are. We decided reluctantly last week. And then we've had a few days to think about it, and we're both super excited about it again. So I think it was just that it's long enough in the past that I've forgotten how much hard work it was, and far enough in the future that we can get quite excited about it. But yeah, we couldn't really have done it without the support already that we've got from the people who attended the conference, who've already bought tickets for next year to give us a little bit of financial stability and provided us with great testimonials. So really need to thank all the attendees, and of course, it wouldn't have been very good if we hadn't had all those wonderful speakers. I mean, the content was just fantastic. So, I'll probably finish those little clips next week and add a few more, because we actually interviewed about another 10 people on top of that. So it was a very busy weekend. Well, thanks for bearing with us while we showed you that. We hope it gave you a good flavour of the event if you didn't get to see online or attend. And thanks, Charles, for that comment. Now, what we're going to do is get into tonight's show. And it's a really interesting conversation. It's a bit of a historical tour de force, but also kind of geographical as well, talking about the States, a lot in the United Kingdom, some relevant to Scotland. We'll head over to Hong Kong. We talk about oil rigs 200 miles from shore. Loads of things covered in this. And just the basic idea is that capitalism doesn't like democracy. And we really get into that, and we think about what impact and effect that could have on an independent Scotland and what effect it's having just now as part of the United Kingdom. I really hope you enjoy this interview. The book was just out this week or last week, so we were one of the first people to get a chance to speak to Quinn, and here it is. Enjoy the episode. Welcome, Quinn Slobody, and thank you very much for joining us on Scotonomics.
Happy to be here.
Well, we're going to talk about your new book, Crack-Up Capitalism. I got an advance copy just a few days ago. I'm making my way through it. It's fantastic. There's some brilliant characters and some brilliant stories in there. I was looking at it as kind of like a history of how capitalism has tried to avoid democracy, what's happening at the moment, what's likely to happen in the future. I'd imagine you'd give a much better summary than I have. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the book and why you thought these were really important stories to tell?
Sure. Well, I mean, to start off with, I'm a historian, which is kind of important context because we do sort of, in some cases, pay attention to sort of the contemporary rush of present day and yesterday's politics, but often we're kind of trying to figure out what stories we collectively have been telling about the more distant past. And in my case, it felt like we had been telling a story about global history since the end of the Cold War, which is pretty recent history, but now, almost 30 plus years on. That was unsatisfying to me. I felt like we had a story about the Berlin Wall falling, history ending, and then globalization kind of taking over. Then only recently, around 2016, with Brexit and Trump, do we get this narrative of a kind of a backlash, a snapback to the space of the nation. And just empirically, from going back myself and looking at material from the 90s, looking at the things that people were writing even in the early 2000s, it was a bit more complicated than that. It actually seemed to me that even at the end of history, so to speak, there was a lot of fear about actually the fragmentation of the global economy. There were a lot of fears of sort of breaking up. I'm speaking to you on the Scotonomics podcast. You don't need to be told that there was a lot of talk about secession, devolution, the possible end of kind of legacy nation states already in the 1990s. And some people were worried about that, but other people were actually kind of excited about that and exhilarated by that. So in the first instance, I would say the book is about kind of writing an alternative history of global politics and global political economy since the end of the Cold War that's much more focused on dynamics of fragmentation and shattering rather than just integration, to suggest that this recent nationalist backlash is actually concealing more than it's explaining. And in the second instance, I'm interested in the history of neoliberalism and the way that a certain notion of governing economies for the sake of the market rather than for the sake of the people themselves has become the kind of dominant mode of the way that states understand their task. And that has mostly been understood at also two scales. You get sort of national politicians like Thatcher or Reagan or Pinochet who take power and then roll out programs internally. And then it gets scaled up to things like the IMF and the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. It gets kind of scaled out globally. What I wanted to show in my book, and hence my interest in dovetailing with the history of fragmentation, was that these neoliberal practices and experiments were often about puncturing holes inside of nation states and producing sort of alternative jurisdictions and sort of quasi-extraterritorial spaces actually inside of nations, so that we can see those two histories sort of weaving together. One is a recent history of fragmentation and breakup as much as integration, and two, that our move towards more kind of market fundamentalist realities often happen in these small spaces rather than just at the national scale or just at the global scale.
And are those two different movements, are they linked or is it just coincidence?
No, they're absolutely linked. So let's say they aren't always linked. So one of the things that the book was doing is to sort of, again, tell these two stories. And one is about the creation of what are often called zones. So export processing zones first started out in places like Taiwan, where especially American investors would take a little patch of territory and get tax breaks, tax holidays, some sort of freedom from regulation or local oversight, and it became an attractive place to set up a factory or kind of a sweatshop, the beginnings of outsourcing. Shannon Airport in Ireland is another great sort of first laboratory for this, right? It used to be the place where planes would have to stop and refuel going from North America to Europe, when planes got better fuel capacity and efficiency, they didn't have to. Shannon was left with sort of a duty-free space, which then became kind of a slightly extra legal space, which you could use to, store wealth, keep things sort of offshore, onshore. So on the one hand, there are these sort of very practical things that were used by investors and states just to kind of get around regulation, often get around local governments. China becomes very interested in using these special economic zones, most notably. But then meanwhile, you have sort of libertarian and neoliberal intellectuals who are watching this happen, who end up sort of putting two and two together eventually and starting to think that this could actually be a really effective way at kind of doing kind of evasive tactics around social democratic governments and democratic populations internally. What if you start creating more and more of these kind of extra legal spaces that could then be used to evade oversight, undermine alternative demands? And the book shows very concretely a series of examples of this, most notably the City of London, and then the creation of the Canary Wharf was a very quite explicit effort to destroy a local government, create a space that was jurisdictionally different from the space around it, within which you could do things that were much more friendly to capital and much more hostile to the forces of social democracy than you would be able to do otherwise. So in other words, not all zones are kind of neoliberal or libertarian experiments, but there are many that are, and my book really homes in on the ones that are.
I mean, was it obvious to people in the 80s that that was happening, or was it this kind of like London's desperate for investment, we just have to do everything we can?
I mean, in this case, it was a pretty open kind of taking of the battle to the labor-dominated city governments and local city councils. That's the way it was talked about internally in the Conservative Party. So Keith Joseph and Geoffrey Howe were people who were big advocates of this model of what they described as sort of creating little Hong Kongs inside of inner cities in the UK. And the explicit intention was to break up kind of what they saw as the entrenched interest groups of local governments and allying with sort of social service grubbing populations and greedy unions. So they were very clearly trying to kind of smash up what they saw as this sort of sclerotic coalition there, and they weren't sort of shy about it. And people at the time were very conscious of it too, right? So the Docklands is great in part because there was such a concerted mobilization against the kind of Canary Wharf version of creating a second city of London. There was a people's plan for the Docklands that I mentioned in passing in the book that you could read about. Among other things, they had a great action where they got together with local dock workers and people who had just moved to the area, working with a lot of newly arrived immigrants as well, and decorated a barge that one of them owned with a dragon shaped in the sort of sinuous lines of the Thames itself, and took the barge up the river and delivered their demands straight to Westminster. And it was an alternative idea of what could happen there. And they knew that they were up against, big finance, allied with the ruling Conservative Party. And it was a battle that they would be unlikely to win. And the decision of the Thatcher government to vaporize the Greater London Council at the same time, which was, under Ken Livingstone, was doing a lot of very interesting and innovative things that we've only sort of caught up to later, pushing people into public transport, doing socially useful technology workshops, doing outreach to immigrant mothers, using languages other than English and interface with newly arrived populations. So things that were like crackpot, lefty practices at the time and are now kind of like best practices at the UN or whatever. So no, it was a war, it was a battle. And smart geographers and urban planners saw it as such at the time. I mean, Doreen Massey is one such example who was already writing in 1980, 81, like this is being claimed to be the creation of sort of freewheeling entrepreneurial spaces of self-invention, right? Like we need to lift regulations so we can innovate. She's like, no, it isn't. It's just a direct handover of state funds to private interests. And that's in fact what Canary Wharf was, right? I mean, it wasn't the creation of the unlocking of entrepreneurship as the current conservative rhetoric would have it. It was simply a transfer of public funds to private hands by way of partially of direct subsidies and tax breaks, but then also the building of infrastructure. So the extension of the Jubilee line, the creation of City Airport. I mean, these are the reasons why the Canary Wharf project succeeded. In a way, it's kind of old-fashioned industrial policy, but in this case, tilted heavily towards the interests of a small number of private developers. And it's striking how one can overlook that in the celebration of Canary Wharf as a success story, for example.
I thought it was quite interesting because in the book you said kind of originally these zones were seen as a way to enhance the kind of cities of the north. And there might have been one of these zones in Liverpool and Glasgow. And I was kind of reading this and thinking, I can't remember that happening. And then, it happened in London. That all makes perfect sense now, because of the amount of infrastructure that goes into there. So it was really interesting that there was obviously a discussion. I'd also like to, that's kind of the past. I'd like to talk about what the Conservative government are doing now. And it seems like they're kind of they have reinvented these kind of zones with the idea of these free ports.
I think that interestingly enough, this is one of those many cases in British politics where you can talk about the early 1980s and the early 2020s without really having to change much of the terminology or even some of the people involved, because there's been so few new policy ideas floated from within the Conservative camp anyway. And indeed, the first Thatcher budget included not only 12 enterprise zones, as you say, sort of arrayed around the country, but also free ports, a series of free ports, which were being proposed to operate exactly the way that Rishi Sunak is talking about them working now. Then as now, the idea was all you need to do is sort of draw a line on a map and lift regulations, lift taxes, and you will unlock entrepreneurial initiative and suck in mobile foreign capital. Sometimes the exact same people are involved. So Almond Butler of the Adam Smith Institute, co-founder of the Adam Smith Institute, is also on the advisory council for Boris Johnson's Freeports council like 2 years ago. I mean, the man has been doing the same thing for decades. The discussion is the exact same for decades. But also for decades, I think there is a kind of important ambivalence or kind of contradiction at the heart of the idea of the free port. And this is something that I would say runs through my book as well, which is to say that there is a rhetoric of negative freedom, right? Like all we need to do is just clear the way and the private forces will do their work. That's never true. The cases where it is effective are cases where the state actually plays a role and extends itself into these spaces, creates conditions. And what I think the contradictory part is how difficult it's been for sort of conservative rhetoricians to just be frank and honest about that fact. I think that the 2019 moment with the discussion of leveling up was actually kind of a step forward just for honesty and kind of clarity, which is like this embrace of the fact that the state actually can be helpful sometimes. We don't have to think about it only as an obstacle or a kind of either or binary between the market doing its work or the state doing its work. I mean, that's simply never been true. It isn't true now and it won't be in the future. I think once you say that this is a question of how to use state power, not whether or not to use state power, then you open up new conversations. And I think that the SNP's sort of proposals of green free ports is a good example of this, right? I don't think that it's inherently true that using small jurisdictional spaces for alternative economic projects is sort of nefarious or always libertarian. You can do this, what I think the S&P is proposing is saying, like, actually, we're going to make larger demands of companies if they're going to get the subsidies to come into these spaces, and they're going to have to be moving more quickly towards carbon neutrality, and we're going to be, using these for renewable technology advances, which is what the United States is doing right now with its Inflation Reduction Act. It's also a big project of just giving state money to private interests, but it's part of a larger goal of a just energy transition. So in that sense, it's not simply just to enrich a small number of people, but it's for a collective kind of vision. So on the one hand, it's the same story being sung for 30 years in Britain. But I think that if there's honesty about statism as simply the way that democracy operates, and that's not a bad thing, then one can imagine sort of alternative visions being contained within these putatively empty spaces. But it's really striking how it's all of the same places. So the same places that are on a map in 1980 are the places that are on a map in 2023. When I was just in London talking about this book, I did 2 events in one day, and in both cases there was someone from Teesside, and they said, yeah, you know, when I was a kid, I think we had a Freeport, and now suddenly everyone's talking about, here comes the Freeport. And in neither case did sort of industry storm back to the region. So if people are disappointed again, aren't they going to get even more resentful against London, the powers that be? And then if the Conservatives disappoint them again this time, won't they shift their loyalties further to the right potentially? So I think there's even self-interest in the case of politicians to drop this sort of libertarian fantasy rhetoric, which the core of the Conservative Party can't seem to let go of, and say, yeah, we start small, we do experiments, but we don't do these just for the sake of some fantasy of the free market at play, but we do it in the service of some larger collective goals of, human survival in this case.
Yeah.
It's interesting what you were saying about the Jubilee line as well. I lived in London also, and I lived on the Jubilee line and saw its extension when I was living there. But coming back to Scotland and the SNP, I'm very clear from what I've read and hear from the Tax Justice Network that Freeports are not a good thing per se. We live in the UK, which is very unequal as a country. The civil service is mainly concentrated in the southeast of England and London specifically. So, if you're seeing that the currency issue is spending out via the civil service, then yes, money is going to be concentrated down there, and it needs to be concentrated all around the country. And I think that these Freeport zones are a poor excuse for trying to make this happen, and really it should come from the civil service in the first space, and businesses by all means should be encouraged. I was listening to Mariana Mazzucato last night, and I'm reading her book just now about consultancies, and I think that's a thing where government should be in a relationship with business, but it's got to be symbiotic, where you are supporting them to an extent as well, but then there has to be regulation. We can't let people just pollute unnecessarily and all these kind of things. So with regards to democracy, I think for the SNP, because this is one way that currency perhaps will flow to Scotland, which is something that is obviously a good thing per se, but is it a good thing on a social level? From what I'm reading from the Tax Justice Network, it's not really going to be. I don't know. So, and I think it is an example of a loss of democracy, I think, when this is being imposed upon us.
In general, I would also, the book is really a criticism of this idea of the creation of sort of extraterritorial zones beyond the jurisdiction of local government. So I don't think as a whole it's a good way to sort of do business or do politics. But I do think that one should be, sensitive to the fact that the politics are not always the same inside of these spaces, and that one could incentivize investment in ways that, draw attraction to certain areas, and that this simply is the way that investment works, right? It's not only within zones that developers are given tax holidays and subsidies for building a new building or new factory. That's the incentivized model that exists. So yes, no suggestion that any kind of a Freeport or a zone is a panacea or kind of a replacement for workaday legislation. But I think that the range of activities within this container is quite large. And one of the interesting things is, if you look globally, what do people do when they set up these special economic zones? We usually think of them as places for kind of sweated, low-wage labor. And that is what they've been most successful as. But there are also places for services. So if you go to the Philippines, for example, they have some of the most of these SEZs, but they're not really doing a lot of manufacturing. It's a lot of call center kind of a work, sort of back office, more like white collar type administrative work is happening there. So I think that it's also the optic of the zone for me is also a way of seeing globalization in a way that doesn't just think of those two scales of globe or nation, but sort of sees how supply chains often knit together these very small nodes inside of countries. And that, when we say that, let's say Britain and the Philippines have a relationship, it often means that these very, very concentrated, territorially tiny areas within the Philippines has a relationship with the British economy and not the nation sort of as a whole.
Just wonder if you could just cover Hong Kong and what your views, because certainly on the kind of the libertarian right, it's very much, hey, this is where we want to be heading, but Hong Kong's not as kind of capitalist a country as you might think.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the book begins with Milton Friedman standing, with the Hong Kong skyline behind him in 1978. And it does that for a reason. And this also sort of plugs into the way that I think, not just sort of trying to parse out policy ideas in the book, but really trying to think about different narratives of the 20th century. And why does it start in Hong Kong, and why that? And why is Hong Kong important to the book? It's kind of the most important place in the book, in a way. The book begins and ends with Hong Kong. Well, partially because I think that historians, insofar as they have a story about the 20th century, one of the things they'll always say is it's an era where you move from a world of empires, 1900, to a world of nation states, after the Second World War, and then by 2000, and maybe something like globalization by the end. But really, that's one of the things that everyone would say. How can you say anything otherwise? What's interesting about the 70s, though, is when sort of the empires have really broken up. We have decolonization as a realized reality almost everywhere in the world. The new nation states of the third world and the global south are often unhappy with the kind of global economic settlement, right? They feel like they're still suffering from the legacy of colonialism. They're locked into being, only raw material exporting nations, and their terms of trade keep deteriorating year to year. There's a kind of exploitative north-south dynamic. So decolonization ends up being very disruptive to kind of global political economic stability if you're someone who's just interested in kind of maximum efficiency and maximum productivity and profitability for the existing powers. So someone like Friedman was worried, actually, about decolonization and worried about democracy, because decolonization was a movement to the sort of realization of a kind of one nation, one vote principle in its best case in the side of the General Assembly of the United Nations. And people were saying, let's push that harder. Let's really get economic democracy behind this political democracy, political self-determination. Why he alighted in Hong Kong and felt like this sort of aha moment. So he was like, this place is really how things should be going. They shouldn't be operating like Brazil or Algeria or Tanzania. They should be operating like Hong Kong. But what was Hong Kong in 1970? It was a British crown colony. It should have been an anachronism, right? It should have been this like strange little place that would be gone soon and was simply like kind of antiquated, sort of strange leftover. And yet he had an insight, which, as was often the case with Friedman, was unfortunately quite a good insight, which is that you could actually engineer other parts of the world to retain qualities that he admired in Hong Kong. So what did he like about Hong Kong? Well, it wasn't a democracy, for example. You didn't have one person, one vote. What did they prioritize in Hong Kong? They prioritized economic freedom as he understood it. So investor security, bank secrecy, very low flat tax, relatively small number of labor laws and regulations. So he thought, this is a kind of a perfect shell for capitalism, actually. And the question then became for him and many other people, how do you kind of replicate this in an era of decolonization and democracy, right? How do you get a kind of undemocratic colony in a kind of, as a template, when that seems to go at cross purposes and against the tide of history, so to speak. And so these export processing zones, these free ports, these special economic zones are often quite explicitly attempts to sort of take that model of Hong Kong and replicate it around the globe, even within democratic nation states, right? So it's like, how can you make little small crown colony-esque spaces, even when, as you say, in Hong Kong, I mean, Hong Kong is not what it was in 1978. It's been absorbed into the People's Republic of China. Some of the things he admired, and it must be said that he's not a complete sort of evil genius. He admired the civic freedoms of Hong Kong, as I did and do myself too. So you could have, a robust public sphere. You could have a lot of debate. You couldn't have the vote, and that was the thing that he actually thought was good. Civic freedom, good. Political freedom, bad. And he saw those things as very separate. It's quite reminiscent of sort of 19th century models that were still more corporatist or on the model of estates, right? Because the different branches of business in Hong Kong would have votes. Corporations would have votes and have some influence, but ultimately the chief executive, as it was called after 1997, would be appointed straight from Beijing. And before that, the colonial governor was appointed straight from London or Westminster. And the financial minister was actually, the financial secretary was more important than the governor. So there was ways that there was a kind of a rule between the major banks, the major legacy corporations, which had all started out as opium smugglers, of course, in the 19th century, and these political appointees. And then below that, at local level, yes, there was some level of representation, as there is in China, by the way, right? There is a lot of small local scale government even to this day, while the major levers of power exactly remain locked in for a particular interest group. One of the starting points of the book, in a way, was looking at this moment when the handover to China was being negotiated between Britain and the PRC. And I knew that my sort of neoliberal intellectuals like Friedman loved Hong Kong. And I knew that they were worried about what would happen to it when the CCP took it back in 1997. And so I was curious to see what they thought of this period of the 1980s, when the terms of the handover were being debated, in which it ended up being the drafting of what became the basic law of Hong Kong, kind of their mini constitution. And the remarkable thing I discovered when I was reading this material was that the CCP and the existing British colonial government and the Hong Kong business interests all wanted the same thing. There was actually no oxygen between their different visions of how the future Hong Kong should look.
It was like a takeover, wasn't it? It was like a business takeover rather than a kind of birth of a new nation or a movement of a new nation.
Yeah, or more like a merger, right? Like it was like a merger and acquisition. You changed the CEO, but you didn't actually radically change the structure of the corporation of Hong Kong itself. So they all wanted the same thing. They wanted rule of law. They wanted bank secrecy. They wanted open borders for capital and money. They wanted a locked-in low tax rate. And the people like from the Hoover Institution, this conservative think tank at Stanford in the United States, were writing at the time, like, this is remarkable. The Chinese communists have just created a constitution that is actually more economically free than the United States Constitution. That's what they're saying. And we actually need to study the CCP version of economic freedom that they've locked in Hong Kong to bring it back to the United States itself. So this is, I mean, if there's one thing that I think isn't immediately obvious when you read the book, but for me is perhaps the most important thing about it, is that I think in ways we haven't totally taken on board in our own understandings of history, there's been a kind of reversal of polarities since about the 1980s and 90s, where for a very long time it was just assumed, the West was leading. It was the rise of the West, how the West won the world, how the West got rich and no one else did, and so on. And this follows on, especially in Britain, from histories of empire, a sort of glorious world-spanning polity of the British Imperium. But sort of quietly and in the background, since the 1980s, this has been eroded piece by piece, actually, by people who are in power and by political ideologues. And more they look to East Asia, they look to the Gulf, I think, above all. They look to Southeast Asia. Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai are actually the places now that the Conservative Party, the sort of banking elite, and in some ways the kind of writers of a certain right-wing economic history see as the places that are actually innovating capitalism, creating new forms of governance that are actually, increasing efficiency, increasing productivity, and should more and more be replicated and imitated back here in the West. So the idea that the West is ahead, I think, is not only been eroded recently by the rise of China, but it's really been since the late 70s and 80s that the Asian tiger economies and then the extraordinary rise of a place like Abu Dhabi or Dubai or even Saudi Arabia has served as kind of templates for, how are they doing this? What's the recipe? How are they sucking in all this money? How are they constraining democracy in ways that increase economic growth?
That is fascinating. For me, it was almost a weakness of kind of neoclassical capitalism when they were looking at Hong Kong, and this idea that you can just replicate a Hong Kong somewhere else. And you covered it in the book. Well, you can't really do that. But a classic, Friedman and his gang would have been saying, just take that, put that somewhere else, and create a Hong Kong. And what he said was, well, Hong Kong is right on the tip of China, right, which is hugely important. All the people who originally set up there were from China, so they had all the deep kind of cultural connections and the institutional support in China as well as Hong Kong. And I thought that was fascinating because it was a much broader perspective of how an economy works.
Absolutely, and this persists to the present, right? It's nowadays people talk about growth models or growth regimes when you talk about sort of the way that national economies should realign themselves for global competitiveness and so on. And that model is almost always premised on a kind of amnesia or an ignorance about history and geography. With my students, we just read sort of World Bank talking about the rise of the Asian tigers in the 1980s. And, they talk about the way that they organized internal investment, sort of macroeconomic stability, increased human capital investments through primary and secondary education, and all of these things that were happening inside the borders of the nation. And at no point did they mention the word Cold War or the fact that, the United States had military bases in South Korea and Japan, which brought them into the kind of family of the American locomotive, to mix metaphors, that was obviously extremely advantageous. They didn't mention the fact that Singapore is at the choke point of global trade for over a millennium. I mean, for over a millennium, if you wanted to get from the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, you had to go through the Straits of Malacca. There's no way around it. So you can't just make Singapore happen on the coast of Central America by simply, strangling democracy and cutting regulations or doing some state spending, because there is no other Strait of Malacca, right? You only have one. So the conditions beyond the kind of cookie cutter template are very easily and sort of, one has to think, kind of deliberately repressed or forgotten when people suggest that you can just do growth by just replicating certain models, aspects of this or that model and doing them elsewhere. And the book in many ways is the sort of the story of people trying and often failing to kind of make miniature Hong Kongs happen all over the world. And Friedman is one. Deng Xiaoping in the Pearl River Delta with Shenzhen and South China is another example where it is more successful for very specific reasons. But a later chapter talks about Paul Romer, Nobel Prize winning economist, who in 2009 says the same thing. Hey, why isn't every place in Africa making itself into a miniature Hong Kong? All you have to do is ring fence a little space and give control of that space to a patron country, preferably a place like Canada. I mean, this is literally what he's saying in 2009. You give yourself over to recolonization, and you can be Hong Kong too. There's no reason why that would be true. Like, there's absolutely no precedent for blank places on the map becoming places like that. They almost always have 100, 200, even millennium-long histories of being nodes and spaces of trade and exchange. And it's very hard to break with that path dependency, actually.
Yeah.
The rise in misogynistic culture, which, I'm in my later 50s. I had thought that had died in the 1970s and 1980s, but now we're seeing a rise again of, with the likes of Andrew Tate, his recent arrest in Romania. I can't help but feel that this desire for this asset grab, in a way, which is really what colonialism is, and these types of colonies, comes from a place of fear. And that fear is driving this to a great extent. do you think, this misogyny, this fear, these things are interlinked, this desire for, owning things, and then, perhaps on a more cultural level, that perhaps the owning of women in some ways as well, these things are all interlinked. It seems like we've gone through a phase in the 1970s of being more enlightened, but somehow we've reversed in some ways, and we're going back to a darker place.
Yeah, no, I think there is one can draw these sort of connections. I mean, the people that I study were very much concerned about the kind of things that, you would describe rightly as moments of kind of enlightenment or progress, right? So it was precisely things like the mainstreaming of feminist demands, or the mainstreaming of things like affirmative action, or the mainstreaming of environmentalism as something that was even taken up by, the EU in the 1990s and going forward, that made libertarians and people on the right extremely concerned. And they were concerned that, as was repeated over and over, that after the end of the Cold War, red communism had gone green, and the new danger was threefold. It was, in the absence of old-fashioned communism, it was environmentalism, feminism, and anti-racism or civil rights. These were the new things that were going to control people, take away their freedoms, to do things they don't want to do. And when I say people, I mean basically men, and basically white men. So this is also one of the impetuses to the things I described in my book, which is the desire to kind of escape or exit or drop out of existing legislative structures or societies, to find spaces that are supposedly free of these, what they saw as suffocating or strangling regulations. And it's very much a settler sort of frontier fantasy, right? It's an idea of homesteading without even the family in tow. Like, I'm just going to go and find new territory where I can get away from all of these people that want me to care about pronouns and the rights of people other than myself. So the part of the book that gets, I would say, most closely connected to this type of stuff is when I'm talking about the sort of Silicon Valley techno-libertarian fantasy, which is, it gets absurd very fast. So one of the things I talk about is this move towards so-called seasteading, which is the idea of, sort of setting up new jurisdictions on barges or kind of purpose-built platforms beyond the legal control of existing states. The one step beyond that is something that's been proposed called Hayek Islands, which are just little sort of aluminum pods on steel poles, sitting in the middle of the Caribbean. And if the neoclassical model sort of represses geography and history, this idea of being able to escape just represses the entire apparatus of social reproduction that is necessary for just the basics of everyday life, right? I mean, what these people think is they'd be able to replicate their life in San Francisco, where they can press a button and food appears, and press a button and the maid appears, and press a button and maybe a sexual partner appears, that they can just make that happen anywhere in the world, because why wouldn't access to all of life's needs be as frictionless as that? So what if you could have that, tap immediately into all of the world's resources at the stroke of a button, touch of a button, and be free of the supposedly strangling regulations of wokeness that have shut down individual freedom? This is what they imagine. Of course, it's utterly fantasy. It's utterly symptomatic, right? It's something that can only be understood on the therapist's couch, because this could never exist. And some of the really amusing anecdotes around this do come up in my book and have been written about in very scathing ways elsewhere. There's one of my favorite things is a Guardian long read about this cruise ship called the SS Satoshi, named after the inventor of Bitcoin. And a bunch of libertarians bought it, when cruise ships were going cheap during the pandemic, and wanted to make it a kind of new country that could exist, beyond the reach of the grasping state, a kind of, Atlas Shrugged style micro community. And how quickly that failed is really, really funny. It lasted not even a week, I think. The ship started to break down. They found out they needed insurance to even leave the harbor. They couldn't find anyone who wanted to live on this ship, actually. So rich people might talk about moving to a little Hayek Island pod, but they're not actually going to do that because they want to be able to take advantage of like an exploited underclass whenever they want to. So that is, very often a kind of a masculinist ideology for sure. It doesn't even have the kind of respectability of traditionalist right-wing values, which at least is open about saying like, well, we do want women, we just want them to be, subordinate to men. This libertarian vision is just sort of seems to forget that the problems of, say, reproducing a generation or like daily life would even be a problem, right? These things are just assumed to be technologically solvable anytime and any place.
In your book, you mentioned the UK quite a lot. Should we be proud of that? And also, we're in favour of Scottish independence. And another thing that I picked up from the book was this kind of like, in essence, be careful what you wish for. If there's these people who are looking across the globe for these states that they can capture, these small states that are connected, to a big market, is this something we should be worried about, do you think, in terms of independence?
Well, I think there's a couple ways of looking at it. I mean, I think that the virtue of these kind of crack-up capitalists, as I describe in the book, is that they don't actually think that there should be one economic model everywhere. So if you take them at their word, they believe in what they call like competitive federalism, meaning that you should be able to sort of choose from a range of options if you happen to be mobile enough that you can just pull up stakes and move to a new place. So their vision is even the United States being broken up, I mean, let's be honest, as it increasingly is, into places that have very different kind of regulations, laws. Some places have higher taxes, some places have lower, some people have progressive schools, others less so. So in their best guise, they would say that there would be nothing per se wrong about having, let's say, a more social democratic Scotland and a more conservative England, and that this would be actually good because it would then allow for investors and individuals who, again, in this fantasy world, can just move to whatever country they want to kind of see, well, which one works better, like to sort of give a kind of proof of concept to the idea that states should be able to be diverse and competitive. So I don't think that it's the case that the act of secession, for example, like would by necessity lead in a particular direction. The second way I would answer that, though, is that the idea of exit is often itself a fantasy, right? I mean, Britain is a wonderful ongoing example of this, that to leave the European Union was only briefly by some real fantasists seen to be as to sort of throw off the shackles of regulation, like per se or something, right? I mean, to me, the lasting paradoxical but kind of beautiful image of the last decade maybe is people with like the yellow vest gilets jaunes demonstrating that say the word WTO rules on the back, right? Like you have here this totally paradoxical thing, which on a moment's reflection makes perfect sense, which is like to leave the EU was actually not to enter a kind of ungoverned space, but was actually just to exist in one of the other many layers of regulation that exist for a global economy to work in the first place. So were Scotland to leave the United Kingdom, they would not be off in like, blue sky, space of self-invention. It would be like, well, let's choose now which regulatory regime works best for us, and let's not fantasize about true exit because there's no such thing in a globally interdependent world. But you can have better and worse forms of integration. I firmly believe in that. And I think that globalization can certainly be made more fair through the elimination of things like investor-state dispute settlements that give corporations more power than countries, and to use trade agreements to move towards just energy transition rather than just the protection of capital rights. So I think that part of what my book is also an argument against the delusion of exit being something that is ever actually possible. We're stuck with each other, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, right?
Yeah. Do you think that a lot of these people just really find the concept of community difficult? Obviously human beings are complex, And if you have to work with them all the time, it can be quite tiring because they're as I say, complex. They think very differently from each other. You, as a human being, you have to navigate that constantly. I think as a woman, you have to learn to navigate that more, I would assert, than men maybe have to do. And you know, this thinking that you're talking about in the book, it does seem very masculine to me. Do you think that's the issue here? Is this that the communities, instead of seeing it as a positive, it's seen as a troubling irritation?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that it's a dissatisfaction and annoyance with the reality of living in a society, actually. And it's a model of government and a model of organizing a society that is based on the workplace in which they're the boss, right? I mean, this is, I think, often openly what the people I'm writing about want to do. And to be honest, it's, you know, since the era of Blair and Clinton, it's also been the way that Britain and the United States has understood things too, which is we need to make the practice of government more business-like. We need to govern more like the way that corporations do, and you know, measure outcomes and create benchmarks and kind of evaluate and assess productivity the same way that a good boss would. And the end result of that is what you say, which is you don't accept as a given that like humans are messy and have different and sometimes irreconcilable ideas, and all democracy can ever do is like provisionally knit together completely you know, adverse ideas of the common good at any given time. But you say like, no, we need to make a business plan, we need to roll it out, get rid of the dead weight, you know, jettison the things here that aren't working, and do what, you know, they would call in bankruptcy law like a restructuring, right? This is a way of approaching politics as the same way you know, vulture capitalists look at like a distressed asset, like what can be salvaged here, what's useless. Sorry, that's not how societies work. You can't just, you know, chop off and get rid of like unperforming units. Like you need to figure out ways that everything can sort of hobble along.
So it's that complete misunderstanding of how community is so important. Yeah. And are interconnected with this is often troubling and difficult, but challenging intellectually, and that's good, and it should be embraced, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I guess the kind of underlying intention of my book, if there's anything, is to kind of expose and discredit people who adhere to this ideology, even if they don't admit that they do, so that we can move on and do something actually productive with like, you know, humankind, right? Like I just think there needs to be a kind of a naming and shaming in a way of like people whose ideas are still stuck in the past or stuck in these sort of forms of amnesia and ignorance to the point that they will never be productive. And I will claim that I've already had some success in this, because I can't remember if either of you saw this, but, you know, former short-time Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, reviewed this book already now for The Spectator, and gave it basically a glowing review. I mean, he seemed to think that it was like thumbs up. And to me, this is like perfect. This is actually, I've just fulfilled my goal, because I've exposed, and not that he needed any more exposure or discrediting, but it's like the fact that he thought that this was like a valid set of ideas at any level suggests to you just like the total poverty and bankruptcy actually of that way of approaching, you know, the intractable problems of human life.
Quinn, thank you so much. Your book is available now, Crack-Up Capitalism. I'm about halfway through it, and it's absolutely fascinating, and I'm so pleased we were able to get you on to the show. I thoroughly recommend it to anyone watching and listening to the show. I enjoyed the interview. Thanks again.
Thank you for the invite. It's good to chat.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Karen, I thought you were doing a little round of applause for Quinn there. It was fascinating. I really enjoyed watching that back. What are your thoughts watching it back after doing it almost more than a week ago now?
So first of all, can I apologize to our audience for my inability to control my Twitter notifications? So I've managed to sort that, and I spent quite a bit of time at the beginning trying to sort that. Yeah, this was really interesting interview, and so some of the themes he brought up, the either or binary view of the state, and how the pandemic has perhaps woken up market fundamentalists to the symbiotic nature of public and private sector and how they work together. I think that was really good. He also brings up that concentration of the civil service in London, and geography as well. Do economists and politicians really understand how geography changes things? The Strait of Malacca being a really good example of that. You just can't create Singapore somewhere else. That's just nonsense. And then the other libertarian fantasies, things I hadn't heard of, seasteading and Hayak Islands. That was really interesting. I hadn't heard about that before as well. I mean, it really does concern me, William, because you'll know now that abortion is now banned in 13 states in the US. This is really misogynistic stuff that's happening in the US. It's really scary to me. And it's really scary that, it could perhaps be coming into Europe in certain places as well. So, that misogyny thing really, it does worry me. And I think it worries a lot of women as well. That thinking about, wanting to be the boss in society as well, rather than just actually having to deal with the complexities of it. Also really interesting the way he looked at that as well. And then finally, Kwasi Kwarteng's reaction. that was beautiful. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Just to be able to read that and think that it was any kind of justification for that lifestyle that he basically demolished in the kind of the 300 pages of the book. As Quinn said, really highlighted Kwasang's view on the economy, on society. It was it was really interesting. Well, I'm now just about halfway through, and I'd certainly give it a review, but from a very different perspective as our former chancellor. That's all we've got time for tonight. We've done a full hour, which is not what we do every week. And you may have noticed that we've gone to 2 shows a month, and we've still got a lot to do to catch up on the Festival of Economics. We might be back to 1 a week when we get into the summer, but we have lined up our next few episodes. Next episode, which in 2 weeks' time, we're going to look at how the UK government is funded and how that's different from the Scottish government. And it's certainly a theme that we've covered a good few times on the show, but I want to go into it in quite a bit of detail just to explain the role of taxes and the role of bonds and funding and spending, and we just kind of want to break that down kind of as simply as possible. And we really hope that it's an episode that you can share widely, and hopefully get a lot of people on, because it will be live. We'll be taking questions and doing explainers as well. So please do look out for the promotion on that one and join us in a couple of weeks' time. And then after that, we've got an interview with Ben Ray about the gig economy and what impact that has on the economy and society. So we've got a couple of cracking shows coming up, and we've probably got a show for our patrons only, speaking about the Reform Scotland report on VAT and extra tax raising powers. So loads going on. Please stick with us. That's the extended interview with Quinn is on our is on Patreon, and you can link to it from our website. Thanks so much for joining us. Please do keep in touch with us on Twitter, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. Kieran, thanks for joining me. I'll see you later.
Bye.